In 1642, he is asked to do a group portrait. Now, group portraits were very popular in Holland because there were a number of companies. They were supposed to be military companies, but in fact they were more of social groups. But they called themselves the military companies. So it's kind of an organization of civil guard as well, charged with protection of the city. And they loved doing group portraits. But usually, we will talk about Frans Hals in one of our lectures, usually these group portraits were organized very cohesively with everybody given the same prominence as they were having dinner. And in fact, Frans Hals will be next to Rembrandt. He's the greatest Dutch painter. And Frans Hals did very many of these paintings, and everybody was very satisfied. The light evenly falls on the entire group. Everyone is prominent. Everyone is given his characteristics and his features. And then Rembrandt, as Rembrandt does, did something completely different. Well, today it's called night watch. It's because the painting in fact darkened with time. It wasn't supposed to be so dark. It is a group of civil guards under the leadership of Captain Frans Banningcock right there, the tall man in the center. And they're assembling in the morning light, in fact, together to meet and to become an escort to Marie de Medici, who was visiting Amsterdam at that time. It has to be said that Saskia died the same year, before he even started painting this canvas. What we see is the assembly of men in front of this large, very large arch, and there's a lot of action. There's a great deal of activity. Everybody is doing something. We can even hear them doing it because here's the drum, and man is playing the drum. There is a man who is almost about to shoot his gun. There's activity, there's singing, as you see, there is talking, so clearly a lot of noise is happening. However, not all men are seen identically, as was the case with this, for instance, with Frans Hals. But yet all men pay the same amount of money to have their portrait done in this group portrait. Some people are in fact added just for the sake of the composition, who had nothing to do with it. There is a mystery about this painting. If you listen to the story that developed out of it, it's that the painting was not accepted, was not well accepted at all, and that with the death of Saskia on top of it, Rembrandt's fortunes turned quickly after this, and he received fewer and fewer commissions, and later on he was forced to sell the house, to auction his possessions, and moved to a poor neighborhood. Well, the facts support this version, the facts of his life. For whatever reason, from about the death of Saskia, his fortunes began to decline. It seems that possibly that his style was no longer as popular or as well received as it was before. But then other accounts tell us that no, the painting was in fact well received, and that he did have commissions afterwards, but nevertheless his fortunes, his worldly fortunes did decline. Whether it's true, one story is true, the other story is true, we don't know. So we have to rely on the facts of life. Interestingly, here in the middle he paints this mysterious girl with a rooster. There's a rooster hanging from her belt, and she looks like Saskia. It's almost as if the spirit of Saskia is with him, no matter what he does. And even when he paints a company of the civil guard, he thinks of his deceased wife. And then the two most prominent men are the captain himself and then his lieutenant. The lieutenant is slightly shorter, or actually considerably shorter. The captain is dressed in black with a beautiful red sash across his chest, whereas the lieutenant is all in yellow, thus bringing out the light all the more. And as I said before, from the very early on, Rembrandt's brush seems to be loaded with light, with effervescence, and with effervescence, and that's what we see in so many of his paintings. Again, the canvas darkened considerably with time. It was also cut up. The sides, it's very large. I mean, all these men, all these people are human size, and so it was cut up, then darkened, then acquired this name of the Night Watch, which in fact it was not. But it is very significant not only by its execution, but also by the fact that about this time, about this year, Rembrandt's life will change. This is Franz Hall. He still receives commissions, and as you see, this is 20 years later, and he still receives them, but his style will change from the earlier style. He's no longer as interested in action, in physical movement. He's considerably more interested in sort of a psychological drama. And here is another group portrait, and in this group portrait, in fact, everyone is seen from frontally, and everyone is given the same prominence. But again, it's not that no one is posing here. It seems because here they're all posing. Yes, they're having a great time. They're at the banquet. This, in fact, was the formula. This was the standard for these group portraits for the civil guards, and there were many in Amsterdam. Rembrandt chooses to paint them as they in fact discuss their affairs. This is the syndics of the clothmakers guild, and the way they look, they're not at the banquet, even though no question they had many a banquet. They are placed at a table, covered again with the beautiful Turkish rug, and the accounts in front of them. They're discussing the accounts. This, in fact, is more similar almost to the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp. They're discussing the accounts, and again, it's as if they're discussing the accounts with more people who are looking at them. It always seems to be another table with other accounts, with other people, and there's a conversation going on between everyone. He paints, at this point, he paints in this thick impasto, and this impasto conveys the features of the man. He builds up form now in paint, in this impasto, and every brush stroke is filled with light, even though by now he's as interested in the shadow as he is interested in the light, and with time he'll be interested more and more in the shadow. After Saskia's death, he will have a lover, which was sort of a strange affair, but then that woman will disappear, and the woman who will become essentially his second wife was Hendrike Stoffels. They will never marry, and the reason they will never marry was because, strangely, Saskia's will stipulated that he cannot receive income from her estate if he marries. He can only continue to receive income from her estate if he stays a bachelor, and which is why he and Hendrike never married. She came into the house as a servant, but very soon became his wife for all intents and purposes. and they were a household of three. Titus was growing, and Hendrike, and then of course Rembrandt. Rembrandt was never a practical man. He had no idea of what to do with the money he had, and now that he will not have money, all the more so difficulties will have to be met. So Titus and Hendrike will actually form a company, a dealer's company, and put Rembrandt on a salary to introduce some sort of stability into their finances. And yes, the house will have to be sold, the artifacts will have to be sold, and Rembrandt will have to move to a poorer neighborhood. But he continues to paint, and this is a remarkable painting, and this is of the Princess Danae, who was a daughter of a king of Crete, and it was predicted that her son would depose the king, so the grandson would depose the grandfather. Therefore, the grandfather made a decision to lock up his daughter, which is what he did. But of course, Zeus has eyes that see through all impediment, and he saw Danae and fell in love with her. So he appeared to her as gold rain and impregnated her. She will give birth to the hero Perseus, and of course Perseus then will dethrone his grandfather. And this is the topic that many painters loved, particularly Titian painted it over and over and over again. Here is Danae, painted 200 years earlier, with the shower of gold, and Titian loved that particular form of a woman, of a female nude that he actually borrowed from Michelangelo. But here she is represented as a passive recipient, and her maid, in fact, is catching all the gold that she can from heaven, while Danae's left hand, in fact, is positioned on between her legs, and there's a little dog on the side. Beautiful woman, submits to her fate and accepts that fate. This is not how Rembrandt paints Danae. First of all, this is not an ideal classical body. This is a body of a real woman. This is the body of Hendrike, most probably, and she's not a passive participant in the foretold prediction. She loves what is happening. She can't wait to receive her lover. And what Rembrandt really does is painting the love between him and Hendrike. It will be a different love than between him and Saskia, but love nevertheless, and warmth nevertheless, and that is how he paints Danae here. We don't even see gold very well. The servant has no active role to play, as she did, but the bed itself seems to be blessed. It is blessed with the gift of gold. It's blessed with the golden angel that hovers above Danae's head, and she's surrounded by luxury. But in this case, it's sort of luxury of love more than anything else. Something dreadful happened to this painting in the 80s. It's in St. Petersburg, and in the 80s and 1980s, there was a madman who threw some acid onto this painting and then slashed it several times, and it was severely damaged. The right arm, the face, they were all damaged. The restorations began the same day, as you can imagine, and a great deal of attention and affection went into restoration. Now it's hopefully it is restored and hopefully restored to its original condition. But a number of paintings, they're clearly so expressive, and they're so full of human aspects that some humanity objects or takes it too closely to heart and wishes to destroy what is beautiful and human. And here are the two of them. And this enormous difference between the two. This is a princely product of a classical, beautiful female body who accepts her fate, whereas this is a very human, very, very real woman who loves what is happening and willing to return the love and affection. And speaking of humanity, great humanity, here's another painting by Rembrandt, and this is the painting of Bathsheba bathing. Now, this story here, this is taken from the Old Testament as opposed to Greek mythology. And King David, as he walked on top of the roof of his palace, he saw this young woman, Bathsheba, bathing in her own courtyard, and he loved what he saw, and therefore arranged for her to come to him, and ultimately Solomon will be born of that union. However, Bathsheba was married to a man she supposedly loved, and David will send him off with an army and then instruct the officers to leave him unprotected, which of course guaranteed his death, so that he could possess Bathsheba. And often the scene is painted while Bathsheba is bathing, or portrayed in positive light. Here, for instance, here is Bathsheba at the fountain, as portrayed by Rubens. Everything spectacular. She too here receives a letter. She seems to be somewhat surprised, but at the same time welcoming the news. She's already, her hair is already being brushed by her servant, and it's almost as if while receiving a letter, she is already preparing herself for this concubinage with the king. And beautiful reds everywhere. The composition is somewhat diagonal, and there's King David right there. So everything is happening at the same time, and it's full of typical Rubenesque panache and brilliance. This, on the other hand, is what Rembrandt does. He paints a woman alone. And with the death of Saskia, of course, more and more his thoughts will be concentrated on the idea of loneliness. And we will see it in his painting as well, how ultimately everybody is alone, and the older one becomes, the more alone one becomes. But even in the young age, that too goes through, trickles through our lives. And he shows here a beautiful young woman, again, not a classical beauty, certainly not an idealistic body, but a very, very warm human body. As her husband was sent away, she has no support. She has absolutely no one to rely on. And here she receives, she's not bathing here, she receives the letter. The letter is in her hand, and her face is full of great, great sadness, because she knows she cannot disobey the king. The king had chosen, she must obey. But at the same time, she mourns her husband, she mourns her life as she knew it, she mourns her family. And the idea of loneliness and inability to rely on anyone, to have to make this decision that was in fact made for her, Her servant is dressing her up. Otherwise, she's nude. I mean, she's supposed to have just come out of the bath, presumably as the letter arrived. And the whole attitude is that of great resignation and sadness. There is no happiness as there is in Rubens. Here are the two paintings together. There's no happiness at this brilliant prospect of becoming the concubine and then the wife of the king. There is no brilliance of color. There is no impetuosity of the brush. Everything is very somber, subdued, lonely, and sad in this painting, as opposed to this. Bathing in the river, it was actually painted the same year, it's 1654, so it's possible, I mean this is Hendricke too, and it's possible that this is sort of a companion piece to the Bathsheba painting, because here she is bathing, and she's bathing in the river as in a tub, which she would be, Bathsheba would be in her home. But here is a woman in her underclothes who is in fact bathing in the river. It is unclear, the beautiful fabrics behind her, so this might be the shore and she just lowered herself into the shallow waters. But the mood is the same. The mood, she's alone, she is about to bathe, she is bringing up her underclothes. In fact, David could in fact see her in the nude, and looks like a companion piece. Loneliness again is in this etching, and here is another woman who is before a Dutch stove. She's completely alone. God only knows what happened to her husband, what happened to her children. And by this point, of course, Rembrandt knows the cost of loss, and he knows not only loss financial, but more importantly, personal loss. Even though he's certainly comforted in his life by having Hendricke there and Titus. Titus will die a year at the age of 27, a year before Rembrandt himself will die. But we see this idea of loneliness even in this wonderful painting of the Jewish bride. He ultimately will move into a Jewish neighborhood, and as a result he will paint many scenes, not only from the Old Testament but also of people around him. Now, we don't know whether this particular couple is Jewish or not Jewish, but he called it a Jewish bride. And even here we have the same strain of loneliness, even in this most intimate and delightful moment. Here is a man, they're both dressed very richly. Rembrandt will retain his love for luxurious fabrics, and he is placing a beautiful jewelried necklace around his bride's shoulders, and as he does so, she seemingly lovingly presses his hand against her heart, right there, and but they're not turned towards one another. They are not smiling at one another. They seem to be lost in their own worlds, and they seem to be separate worlds, which is even in the most loving relationship, as Rembrandt is showing it, it's possible that one still remains a stranger to one another. And it's almost as if he is trying to convey it here. His brush is becoming more and more psychological, more even heavier loaded with this combination of profundity and light, while around the figures we see darkness. On some level, we can almost say it's Caravagesque, but of course it isn't, because with Caravaggio, form was of utmost importance, and light was always, color was always subordinated to the form, where here it's the color that builds the form, and it's the color that projects light, while the rest of the painting is steeped in shadow. This is just a very beautiful psychological portrayal of love, of warmth, of affection, but also of loneliness. And here you see how, you can see here in the close-up, how he uses this thick impasto to build up his form. And the theme continues here. He paints Aristotle with a bust of Homer, but it's almost as if Alexander is there too, because Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great, and here he stands in these very luxurious, again, very rich-looking clothes, and there's a spectacular gold chain across his shoulder, and it's a princely chain that seems to have been granted, it seems to have been gifted to him by a prince, in this case, Alexander the Great. And he stands there with the bust of Homer. Alexander the Great supposedly admired Iliad and the Odyssey and never went anywhere without the scrolls of Homer. He always had his books with him. And thus, that's why I'm saying you almost sort of perceive that Alexander's presence there as well. And Aristotle is looking at Homer, and Homer is represented as blind. Now, blindness is another feature that seems to be important to Rembrandt, because that too, of course, produces loneliness, because to be deprived of an important human function takes you away from regular humanity, but it also introduces a great deal of introspection. And here stands Aristotle, who is, 400 years away from Homer, because Homer wrote in the 8th century and Aristotle is in the 4th, and so 400 years separate them, and yet he perhaps feels more of a relationship with Homer than he does even with his student Alexander the Great, who in fact then went east and conquered the Persian Empire and followed the teachings of Aristotle very little. And here stands Aristotle contemplating on this and feeling a great affiliation to the great blind poet. And here we see the face, again done in very thick impasto and loaded with color. In the same vein is, now let's see, this is 63 and this is 53. This is done 10 years later, and it's done mostly in sort of brown impasto, and here he just represents Homer himself. Homer with his blindness, as he did a number of sketches of Homer. Homer fascinated him, just as the Bible fascinated him. And here is Homer speaking his poetry, because, well, he didn't read it, he was blind, presumably, so he had to deliver it to a group of people he does not see, but his world is very much inside himself. It almost depicts the world of a blind man who does not see color. He doesn't only see his audience, he also doesn't see color. And as such, here we see Homer in these brown tones, ostensibly, but the world of color and the world of greatness, it's all within him. So this streak of loneliness goes through and through. Continues, this is Rembrandt's Saint Matthew. Now, we saw several Saint Matthews earlier. We saw Caravaggio Saint Matthew, and we saw Guido Reni, Saint Matthew. We also saw Saint Matthew of Nicolas Poussin, and that's really more about landscape than the Saint Matthew and the angel. But here are the three Saint Matthews of Caravaggio, painted in the very early 17th century. Then about 20 years later, Guido Reni, and another 30 years later, this is Rembrandt's version. Again, you remember, he never went to Italy. That doesn't mean that he didn't see etchings. He doesn't mean that he didn't see prints, because prints of Italian art were available everywhere in Europe. And Caravaggio, remember, paints his as sort of a lost old man who doesn't know what he's doing, and the angel, in fact, is guiding his hand. Then Guido Reni paints a relationship between the older and intelligent old man and the angel, who understand each other. And finally, Rembrandt's version is that truly of a father and son. And it is Titus who is modeling here for the angel. Here sits Saint Matthew. He is writing himself. This Saint Matthew is very wise. He has lived a long life. He knows the powers of good and evil, and that is what he is about to convey through his scripture. And the angel is represented as someone very loving, as someone who is embracing, who is whispering, who doesn't want to hurt, who wants to be careful about someone he loves. And the beautiful relationship between the two of them is clearly the relationship between Rembrandt and his son. And again, there are no bright colors. The colors are very tenebristic. I know we apply the same term to Caravaggio, but it just essentially means the power of darkness, the power of the shadow, as much as Rembrandt is very much interested in light. He now is equally interested in the shadow. And thus we have this painter who, in his youth, while interested in dramatic action in space, now has become a contemplative philosopher. He continues to paint self-portraits, a number of self-portraits. In fact, I think we have more self-portraits from Rembrandt than from anybody else. But if the earlier self-portraits rather observed the change from a very young man to a mature man, the man of success, the man of privilege, the man of great acquaintance, his older portraits are different. We now perceive again an inner change of a man who knows what loneliness is. The paint is heavier, the portraits are darker, there's stillness in the air as contemplation takes place. This is a decade difference. This is the man in 1659 and here 1669 as he portrays himself. And with each portrait we can see the change, perhaps becoming sadder, perhaps realizing how fickle life can be. But at the same time, he did have Hendrike and he did have Titus, and they did provide him with comfortable living, if not luxurious living, and their lives were dedicated to him. So while all this realization does take place, he also doesn't seem dissatisfied. He looks more of a philosopher who has learned to accept what comes without grief and find pleasure and good in what he has. Here you can see this is this portrait, and again a close-up to show you the brush strokes, how he builds up his imagery with color. Before, a year before that, he clearly still has some of those beautiful clothes that he loved so much, and he dresses himself in these clothes, so his tastes are still very much in the luxurious and the beautiful and the exotic, and also in the effects of light and the ability to portray these effects on his canvas. Here it's never mind some acquaintance being dressed in these beautiful Near Eastern clothes. He dresses himself in these clothes. There's no turban. He has actually a large velvet burgundy hat on, but his garments are very beautiful, very remarkable, but the face, he just stares directly at himself, essentially, as he paints himself, as if now to compare and contrast him as a young man interested in these luxuries, and him as an older man who still retains these interests, but who had grown so much wiser and so much deeper in his understanding of himself, while dressed still in the same clothes. And now he paints a very different return of the prodigal son. Same story, one of the sons receives his inheritance, and while other sons stay with the father and help the father with domestic affairs, with the farm, the younger son couldn't care less. He just runs away and does as he likes. And then at the end, when he spent all his money, because he was a spendthrift, and he has no other place to go, that's when he returns home, and that's when he is welcomed by his father. Here is Rembrandt himself, and what he does here, again, the entire scene is steeped in shadows, steeped in darkness, and this time we don't even see the face of the son. Here, as you remember, in the etching that he did 30 years earlier, we see the face very well, both faces, and but it is no longer the case. We only see the face of the father, and by now this is the year of his death, and Titus died a year before.
That's horrible.
Yeah,
That's so terrible.
I know.
I mean, this whole last sequence is just so poignantly tragic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he clearly loved so much and had
Yes,
so
and
much
to
life,
give, yeah.
and got hurt so horribly.
Mm-hmm.
It's like watching a bleeding canvas.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, and this one is really about loss. And so his son died a year earlier, and we don't even see the face of the son. We just see the face of the father. He completely embraces him. He takes him into himself as if he becomes his body, his soul, his very existence. He couldn't care less about the filthy feet, about the torn clothes, about unwashed body. None of this matters. This is his son. He will take him back in any way or form. And he portrays the father as broken, but at the same time welcoming and resigned and indifferent to whatever happened. All that matters is to have this boy back. And there's another psychological detail in this painting, and that is in the figures of these two men. There seems to be a servant in the background, but these two men now, these are the two sons that stayed behind. that never abandoned their father, that were always there for him, that whatever inheritance they received, they just turned around and added it back to the farm. So they were loyal. They were always there. And yet, what is it that makes the father take them for granted and receive this prodigal as his long-lost spirit? Because that's what we're seeing here. Rembrandt is painting a beloved spirit of a boy who actually died a year ago. But we can sympathize with the two men here as well. They're not touching either the father, they're not really welcoming the third son. They are resentful, and they're resentful for a good reason. So it's really fascinating that while here is Rembrandt, who this is this is the most important thing. He just lost his only son, his beloved son. And but he also doesn't forget that there are other human emotions that are playing an important role. And these human emotions are also very worthy of depiction. And as such, he portrays them on the side. Really just a fascinating attitude to life. And here you can see it. You can see the ripped clothes, the dirty feet, the face, the beautiful, beautiful face of the old patriarch. His hands very firmly placed on the boy's shoulders. There can be absolutely no doubt that he is there to stay. He is not going anywhere. He's completely and totally accepted, no matter what others may think. And this is the one that he did 30 years earlier. And here the two of them together, just for comparison's sakes. There's no resentment there in any faces. This is just sort of a narrative of people coming out of the doors, curious as to what is happening. A great deal of action in the sense of the two of them running towards one another. And of course done in this very, very quick, with these very quick lines that convey the speed of movement. Whereas here, yes, the father and the son just run at one another. That they can't wait to embrace one another. None of this is here. There's none of the speed. It's all extremely still. It's all about reunion of souls, a true reunion of people who love each other very, very deeply. Big difference. And well, here it is. Towards the end of his life, he will lose. He will have lost Saskia, and he will have lost Heinrich, and he will have lost his fortune and his house and his son. He will have a daughter, I think by the name of Cornelia, but he will die a year after the death of his son. A very different life from that of Rubens, for instance, whose life was absolutely brilliant. Rubens too, as you remember, lost his first wife and then stayed bachelor for 4 years, but then his second marriage was very happy. I mean, and his entire life was just one brilliant progression from one advancement to the next. Very, very different from Rembrandt. And yet, had it not been for that tragedy, on the base of the paintings that he had done before that, before the Night Watch, he would be considered a very important painter, there's no question about that. But the true greatness, the true depth, the true spiritualism came with the tragedy. And thus we have, here's a very young, very successful man, just come to Amsterdam, immediately received by all. And here is, it's the same features as you see, but the features have become as deep as his brush strokes, while the brush strokes here are as smooth as his skin. Here the brush became as profound as the man's soul. And thus Rembrandt. And I will see you next week.